Welcome back to the Pursuit of Freedom podcast. I'm excited to have you here and share today's episode with you. It's actually going to be a two-parter. It's that good, and I want to share it all with you. So it's going to be two parts, each about an hour long. I'll be talking with Josh Hoffman, who was diagnosed with major depression at just 12 years old. And we'll be talking about what depression feels like. We'll be talking about why people self-harm, and we'll be talking about how to approach conversations with people who self-harm when you're trying to support them, including what not to say. This is something that's not spoken about much, and I think it's a really important conversation. I think you're going to get a lot of value from it, whether you're someone who has experienced depression and currently self-harms, who has in the past, or whether you're somebody who perhaps hasn't experienced those things, but you want to know how to best support those people in your life who are going through it right now or who have been through it in the past. Before we roll the episode, though, I want to give a content warning. It is a really heavy episode. We do a deep dive. We'll be talking about suicidal ideation and, as I mentioned before, themes of self-harm and other topics in that realm. So if this is going to be triggering for you, if you're not in the right headspace, please give it a skip. You matter, and I care about you, and you deserve to take care of yourself. You can come back to this episode at another time or just skip it altogether. Totally cool, no judgment. And without further ado, let's roll the episode. G'day, and welcome to the Pursuit of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Rosie Burrows, and I'm on a journey to find my freedom so that I can help you do exactly the same. Join me each week as I share the stories of everyday people who have found their own paths to freedom. I'm not going to focus on job titles and accolades because I don't care about that stuff, and neither should you. I want to uncover what truly makes you tick. Who are you when you step away from society's expectations and follow your heart? I still haven't figured it out yet. Have you? Either way, buckle up because it's going to be one hell of a ride. Josh, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be on.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to this. And I don't want to beat around the bush. Let's get right into it.
Let's get right into it. All right.
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, your journey is, it's so powerful to me, and I really want to elevate your voice and allow you to share that with people because at the age of 12, you were diagnosed with major depression.
Yes.
And I'd love for you to just talk us through that journey up to the diagnosis point. How did that unfold for you?
Well, so it was kind of interesting because when I was talking to you earlier, I think around 10 or even 11, I probably actually, or even earlier in my life, because I believe my depression is genetic because my grandma actually suffers with depression. My mom suffered with depression when she was younger.
Mm-hmm.
They all have their own coping with it. My grandma is more like me, where she's medicated, and my mom actually went a whole different route. I'm not sure if you've heard of naturopathy.
Yeah.
She went that route and went kind of extreme in the way of how they had her. Pretty much, they found that sugar was kind of the main thing. That it wasn't like depression. She wasn't trying to fix her depression, but the intolerance part. And so now she, for the longest I can remember now, she's been off of sugar, a no sugar diet, and that's obviously really difficult. But enough about that. I've probably had depression for a long period of my life, but when it actually hit me was 12, and I remember that there was two pivotal times with my depression for 12. So there was I don't know which one came first, to be honest, or how it came. I think I know which one came first, actually. When I was 12, I remember I was in my bedroom just after school and laying down, just thinking. And I started thinking about life. I started thinking about for some background for people. I grew up in a Christianity family and grew up in a Christian background, so there was that uh, influence of God and that God has a purpose for your life and idea. And then I also just knew from my family and society that like people are supposed to have like a passion, work wise and just in general. So putting those two things into account for what I'm about to say, of when I was 12, I was just thinking about these things, and I'm like, I don't have a passion. Like there was nothing that I felt like I had a passion for, or I felt like was calling me out to do anything. Like I couldn't think of like, oh, I have a career that's I want to do, or I don't have a purpose, like a greater purpose to impact people, or a greater purpose for something. And a normal person, even my mom was like, you're 12, like that's not something for you to worry about right now. But like I don't know what it was about me. It's always been a thing that I've, even now to this day, it's always a big thing to me, that passion and purpose and being able to do something that you love in life instead of just following what society tells you to do and stuff. But that's pretty much where that came from, is that I felt like life, what happened is I didn't feel like I had a purpose or passion, or didn't feel like I had any direction in life. And that then my brain started going along the lines of, okay, if I don't have a purpose and passion in life, that must mean that I'm worthless, that I'm hopeless, that I'm meaningless, because the logic is like, oh, God doesn't have a purpose for me, or even if you take out the God equation, life doesn't have a purpose for me, or there's no purpose, or why don't I have a passion? Why don't I have something that is calling out to me, or whatever? And I just got into that space, and it just got into, if anyone that has struggled with depression, how those thoughts can go in kind of a turmoil and just kind of keep circling. So this had been going on for a few months, where I just kept thinking of and going through this in my head, and having this turmoil in my head of, oh, I'm worthless, I'm hopeless, I have no passion and purpose. Why do I have a passion and purpose? And also trying to figure out, okay, what is my passion and purpose? So I wasn't like just being negative. I was trying to figure it out, but nothing was coming. I wasn't being able to figure it out, or I wasn't listening enough, because it's hard when you're in that negative thinking also, I think. And it just kind of got worse than, I think, the negative thinking front of like, oh, I must be like worthless. I have no meaning. Like, why do I even exist? I started getting into the stuff of like, why do I even exist? Why am I here? That type of stuff. Even that one night, it was like that. And, but after like a few months, there was one night I had this like, it's called Awanas, but it's essentially a kind of like a youth group that I went to at the time. And even then I was kind of like, like it was fun because they had like games there, and you got to interact with people and stuff. But my mom was taking me to that, and we were walking up to go into the church, right about to like she drops me off, because it's like for 2 hours or whatever at night. And before we went in, I don't know what came over me to say it, but I was like thinking then, and I think this was the first time I actually had like legitimate, like I probably had some other suicidal ideation and thoughts, but this was like the first like intense time, I think, or like my thoughts were really intense and I didn't know what this meant, and self-harm. And I don't know exactly how intense or how it was going, because it was so long ago, but all I know is that I do remember I was very suicidal, and I was worried about myself and worried about my like I was like very emotional, and I was worried that I
Mm.
might hurt someone else or hurt
Right.
myself
Mm-hmm.
in that state um, at 12. And I told my mom something along those lines. She said, "Oh," and she was surprised, very taken back.
Mm.
And after that, I didn't go to it, or maybe I did go. I don't remember, but that night I really don't. But I do remember after that, a few weeks after that, or a month even, I went to this counselor
Mm-hmm.
or a psychologist or whatever you would like to reference them as, and they diagnosed me. I don't know if it was a first session or if it was 2 to 3 sessions
Mm.
exactly, but it was my mom and me in the room, and it was the counselor psychologist, and we were talking about like it, because back then I was more timid. I wasn't as much of an advocate for myself, so my mom
Mm-hmm.
was more of an advocate, not necessarily with therapy, but just in general.
Mm.
um, Even with like doctors, because I had a lot of stuff that went on in my past, but that's a whole
Mm.
nother thing. Uh, like I had a lot of surgeries, so she had a better
Right.
memory of all of them and all those types of things.
Mm.
And so between my mom and I, from the different perspectives and probably more her perspective, we talked to the counselor and therapist, and
Mm-hmm.
then that day, or maybe after 2 or 3 more sessions, I was diagnosed with major depression,
Mm-hmm.
or major depression disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could, I think it's major depression, but honestly, it could have been chronic. But I think back then it was major depression, and there's been times probably in my life that it could be um, diagnosed as chronic, but I would say it's probably more major depression in general. So,
Mm-hmm.
which are kind of the same when you look up
Okay.
the terms.
So what? Just on that, the because you mentioned chronic depression and major depression. Can you share like just a brief overview? What is the difference between those two? Because I know for me, I'm not super familiar.
Um, Really, from my understanding, when I've searched it up, because even I don't know this super
Yeah.
big of the difference. Chronic depression, or a chronic depressive disorder, or major depression disorder, or major depressive disorder, is like they're very similar. When you look at them side by side, they almost can be called the same, be very similar, almost called the same, or can be confused
Mm.
with another. So a person that's diagnosed with major depression disorder, or someone that's diagnosed with chronic depression uh, disorder, that it's very similar. Like some,
Mm-hmm.
or almost the same. Where if someone says, "Oh, they have major depression disorder," someone also might say, not necessarily chronic depression disorder, but they'll say like, "Oh, this person has chronic depression." And in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, they're not exactly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, I don't fully know where the line exactly crosses of, oh, um, you have a disorder for chronic depression or major depression. I think the thing is, you've had the symptoms. It's like you have to hit 3 to 7 of the symptoms for the DSM
Right.
5 to be diagnosed with any of them for
Mm-hmm.
depression. And then for chronic, it's similar, but the only difference I would say is for major depression and chronic depression, it may be for a longer period of time. I think for major depression, it is you've been feeling those symptoms for as long as 2 weeks straight. And
Mm-hmm.
for chronic depression, it could be, a month to 3 months or something like that.
Yeah. Right.
That is my best
Yeah.
guess, but
Yeah.
I would further advise the listeners to do their own research on it.
There's a lot of nuances, aren't there? And I think there's also a
Yes,
lot of
exactly,
overlap. It can get quite complex and overwhelming if you go too deep.
for
But
sure.
going back to what you were saying, about, you're a 12-year-old, you're in your room and you're just overwhelmed with these feelings of what's my purpose and why am I even here? Like, that's full on. I know for me, they weren't thoughts I was having until I was in my mid-20s, and I think someone
Yeah.
at that age is probably better equipped, generally speaking, to maybe navigate some of that. But
Right.
yeah, even when I went through that, it's overwhelming as someone in my mid-20s. So I can't even imagine what it was like for you as a 12-year-old. They're really big feelings.
Oh yeah. I pretty much questioned I always call it an existential crisis because it really was, and I always call it I can't think of the word, but questioning my existence essentially. And you can I always think back to it. I'm like, there are so many people that, I mean, people do that at some point. Like you said, like you mentioned, like you had that circumstance when you were like in your 20s, and a lot of other people have it at different times in life. Their first one, or because most people have multiple at some point. But yeah, to hit it at 12, or there are other individuals that even have it younger. It's pretty crazy to think about.
What I'm really impressed by is that you were brave enough to share the suicidal thoughts you were having with your mum.
Yeah.
Because I know not everybody,
For sure.
has the courage to do that, or maybe in some situations it's not safe. But it sounds like you had a very supportive mum who advocated for you.
My mom was probably my closest relationship I had at that time. The only other relationship that I would say was like super close was my best friend, and he was also dealing with his own stuff that I helped him through, and he helped me through some stuff also, but he dealt with so much stuff through with life. It's sometimes I didn't like to add other stuff to him, if that makes any sense.
If we go back to 12-year-old you're with your counselor or your psychologist, and you've been given this diagnosis. What was going through your mind at that time?
Honestly, I really, back then, I just kind of accepted it. Because I think I accepted it because I honestly didn't know. Like, I didn't know what that entailed. I didn't, at that time at 12, I didn't have a full grasp of even the world. I had a full grasp of, I guess, my existence, but or had some sort of a grasp of death. I had a grasp that we weren't going to live forever and stuff like that, but I didn't have a grasp of exactly what that meant. And even if I was to ask, like, oh, what does that really mean, and they told me, I still probably wouldn't have fully understood it until like I've gotten older now. And because I still like was in the first stages of it, like I hadn't been having it for very long. While at like 14 or 15, I actually could be like, oh, because I could actually be like, oh, this is what major depression is, because I've been, am I allowed to cuss on this podcast?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I've been dealing with this shit, for lack of a better way to say it, and internally that I had a better way to name it. Like I could be like, okay, yeah, this is depression. While like at 12, I hadn't been experiencing it for that long, so I didn't really know. Like I honestly, when I guess the thing that I thought is when they she first diagnosed me with it, I honestly questioned it.
Yeah.
I honestly was like, I don't know if that's completely accurate. Even if, like, I don't know if this is really depression. I don't know if this is depression or if this is just a bad place in my life, or just a bad state. It also did not help that going through therapy with that counselor for, I want to say it was 3 months. I really just wanted to get out of that therapy office, and I just hated therapy because she did not feel, she wasn't the right fit for me. It almost felt invalidating, or almost, I don't know if invalidating is the right word. I try to push out those memories out of my head. I can't even really remember anything, to be completely honest. All I remember is I was diagnosed, and I questioned it. And the other thing I remember is that after I was done with that therapy, I was so glad that I was out of therapy, because I hated her. I hated the experience. And I actually, even though I was depressed, because I essentially was supposed to be in therapy until I was quote unquote cured, or quote unquote wasn't dealing with the suicidal ideation at least anymore. I was still dealing with the suicidal ideation, but I just kept it on wraps, because I just was done. Like, I was done with her, and I didn't want to talk to her about it anymore and deal with how she was approaching it. I also know that after I was done with therapy with that individual, that I actually like hated therapy after that. I really did not want to, like, I didn't believe in counseling or therapy after that. At that time, at least, I was just like, if this is what therapy and counseling is, I don't want it. And I don't think I'll ever get better through therapy and counseling, that type of thing. So
yeah. I mean, it's such a shame that you had that negative experience, because not only are you 12 years old, probably going through puberty and dealing with all those hormones, but you've also got major
not
depression.
To mention those, right?
Yeah, right. It's hard enough at that time. But I think, unfortunately, it's an experience a lot of us have been through, like having a therapist who they're not a good fit. And it's, and I guess as a 12-year-old, you're not really in a position to go, I want to find someone else, or even able to articulate, this isn't working, I want a different therapist.
And honestly, back then, I didn't know that was an option, no one told me like that was an option, because I didn't know. And no one told me anything. I think what I will tell the viewers, for whatever age they are listening at, that if you have had a bad experience with therapy, don't necessarily give up therapy and counseling, because I had that bad experience with therapy and counseling, and I've actually had now good therapists and counselors, and I will tell you, at least for me, it makes a difference. I know for people, it's not always a good fit for them. Like, the therapy and counseling just doesn't work very well for them. But the other thing I will caution or say to people is that most of the time when people think of therapy or counseling, they think of what is called CBT therapy, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is like talking through your past life and how that potentially affected it. And honestly, in my experience, that doesn't really help depression. It might help other diagnoses, or like trauma, like certain traumas, or abuse, that might help with dealing with going through your past. But with depression, it's more of a present feeling and a more of a present based thing. So CBT can help, but I would advise people to also be aware that look into other therapies and know that there are other therapies out there, not just CBT. There is DBT, which is hard to get into, sadly, because that's what I'm in, and I think it's probably one of the most beneficial ones. Dialectical behavior therapy, it pretty much makes it so you're working with your present problems, and I think that's why, and building up coping strategies. That's why I think it's honestly in my experience, the best. But there's also art therapy. There's music therapy. There's a lot of even I imagine animal therapy and other therapies. So I would say to people that I've given it up or don't like CBT or whatever, um, look into what other therapies that exist and read some descriptions on them and see like, oh, I didn't know that existed. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I didn't either.
We have options, right? I know for me,
Yes.
I've probably been through 6 or more different therapists.
Yeah.
So I would agree with you. Like, if it's not feeling right, move on.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
CBT, I think I'm similar. Like, there's some benefits for me. I'm talking from personal level, but it's definitely a very popular um, therapy right these days, and I would say it's probably the main one.
Yeah, it
But
is
there are
definitely the
others.
main
So
one.
do some research, find what works for you. You know, everybody is different. CBT might be perfect for someone listening, but for someone else, it might not be very useful. So yeah, know that
Yeah,
you have options. You're not stuck.
for sure.
Mm.
No, there's always other options, such as like the art therapy and stuff. Like when I first learned that art therapy was a thing, I was like, that's really cool that you can like paint out your feelings and figure
Yeah.
out through like painting and drawing. I was like, why did no one tell me about this one sooner?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you don't feel like talking about it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. No, absolutely. So would you be comfortable sharing what it was like to have suicidal thoughts? Like, what was some of the thoughts going through your mind, and how did that feel?
Mm. Well, it's kind of hard to think back to like all of them or
Mm-hmm.
what thoughts because they change.
Mm-hmm.
But throughout my life, to give some context to people, I dealt with depression and suicidal ideation, and I still deal with depression and suicidal ideation. But
Mm-hmm.
when it was the at the most intense and the worst
Mm-hmm.
was around 12 to 18, 19.
Mm-hmm.
And with my suicide ideation thoughts, I would say a lot of them were, you don't matter, you're worthless,
Mm-hmm.
uh you don't mean anything, or yeah, you're hopeless, you're worth nothing, no one would care if you died, you should kill yourself. um there was actually this, at some point suicide ideation became problematic in the way that I also had, throughout my life, I had to also keep my anger in. So a lot of my anger became suppressed. And
Mm-hmm.
through that anger being a lot of suppressed anger, I actually started not always having it, but sometimes through suicide ideation, um, there was sometimes I dealt with what I call homicidal ideation, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not as extreme as like people always think, but
Mm-hmm.
it's essentially like thinking of, yes, how a person would think about it as like killing another person, or
Mm-hmm.
or thinking on an extreme level of that. Not that I would do it,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes I did have those. And I also noticed from my own observation as I got older is that, at least for me with self-harm, I did cut. I did. I had a lot of different self harms that I went through. There was times in my life where I cut, uh, punched myself,
Mm-hmm.
scratched myself with my own nails.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like after I felt that I couldn't cut myself with a knife anymore, I went to punching myself and scratching myself because I knew that cutting myself was bad, but there still was those emotions of anger
Mm-hmm.
and the suicide ideation. And my thought process was, well, those aren't better than it. And also, they won't leave the marks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the, because for what I know is that some people, when they cut, this is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, a misconception with cutting,
Mm-hmm.
um, is that sometimes when people cut, they are, yes, not necessarily, are seeking attention, but not seeking attention in the way of like, oh, they're, some people put it as a negative when they say that, like seeking attention, and like, oh, they're just, an attention whore or something like that. But really, they're seeking support. That, that's in the main reason why someone is doing it, if they are showing it. But the more often than not, someone that cuts does not, or purposely chooses to, even if it's on their arms, purposely chooses not to show it, or hide it, or that, because they're scared of what people will say, and they're scared of, the attention. So a lot of times people think that people want attention from it, but often people that have cut, they just are doing it as a way to get out their overwhelming emotions, and
Right. Yeah.
and the arms, I'm not exactly sure why it's not always, but why the arms are commonplace. I think it's because it's one of the first things we see, and just it's easy. You can flex your arms easier, but I also know people, I had an ex I know that did her legs. I know people do their legs commonly too, because it's easier to hide than your arms. Some people even do other places. Now, I don't recommend cutting to anyone, but I also completely understand why people do it.
Yeah. And I think, I'm someone who also, I haven't done it for a while now, but I did self-harm and I cut. And I think for people who have never self-harmed, they find it really hard to grasp why on earth you would ever do that.
Yeah, they don't understand the
They
self-mutilation
don't get it.
process.
And there's a lot of, and there is judgment. I think they come from a good place where they go, what are you doing? And
Yeah,
for
exactly.
me, there was a lot of shame around it.
Mm-hmm.
I know the first time I self-harmed, it was on my hand, so it was very visible.
Oh,
And then people go, what did you do? And my answer was, I hurt myself. Like, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to admit it. And then I didn't want people to see it. I moved to my arms, and at the time I lived in the UK.
right,
It's cooler weather. I wore a lot of jumpers. I could hide it most of the time.
right.
And over time, I shifted to my upper thighs because, like you said, it's really easy to hide. So
Yeah,
there was
exactly.
shame for me. But I always see self-harm as, this might be a bit controversial, but it's a coping mechanism. And I actually think it's a very, in the short term, it's a very effective coping mechanism.
Yes.
Straight after I cut, I would feel much better.
Relieved, yes. I didn't say that, but I 100% agree with what you're saying there, because I think why people do it in the first place, and why people actually do cut, is as a form of a coping mechanism. I think it also is one of those things we know as a society, like, self-mutilation isn't good. We know that we shouldn't harm ourselves. But I also think, like you were saying, that there is such this big shame around it. And that is, in my opinion, if you come across someone that has cut, that is the worst thing you can do. Like, that is one of the worst things you can do, is shame them for cutting, because after they cut, they may regret it already. They may feel guilt for it or shame already. They don't need more shame from other individuals, even if they are, like you said, coming from a good place. Like, why would you, like, questions aren't the best thing to say, of like, oh, why would you do that to yourself? Well, most of the times after the fact, they don't know. Most people don't have an answer for that, because they already have that relief, or it's been a while since they did that cutting, and that was an intense a different intense state, an overwhelming state for them than they are right now. So it's hard for them to, one, it's just hard to explain the overwhelming intense state that they were in when they did it. And two, they're not in that state anymore. So it's hard to also explain to someone. I mean, in layman terms, you would say, I was in a very, very intense and vulnerable and overwhelming state, and that's why I cut. But it's not that simple, obviously.
No.
I think we definitely need to be wary of shaming other people for cutting, or even other what society sees as quote unquote negative coping strategies. No matter if that's drinking alcohol or drugs or something else. There are healthier coping strategies. There are unhealthy coping strategies. But that doesn't mean that's like, there's still coping strategies, and there's a reason why those people are doing them. They're not, people aren't necessarily doing those coping strategies because they want to exactly. I mean, they do. You know what I'm trying to say.
I do. And I think, for each of us, we're just doing the best we can at the time.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and if that's self-harm, then it is. And like you say, it might not be the healthiest way, but it does give some sort of relief and release.
Correct.
And that's why we keep doing it. And it is hard to stop. I don't know for you, but it's almost addictive, right?
It is, and I find that very interesting because I feel like a lot of again, not caution, but I am very careful with saying as unhealthy or bad, because I don't like that, saying it that way, context that way. It is unhealthy, but I don't want to say it like, oh, you're wrong for it, because they aren't.
Yes. Yeah.
That cutting and drinking and doing drugs, that they are addictive in a way. And I think the reason why is because they do have instant relief. Pretty instant relief. But they also leave a lasting impact in some sort of way. A matter if that's with cutting, pain and potentially shame and guilt. Alcohol, maybe it's a hangover or something, or some other factors, physical factors. With drugs, it could be a whole different thing. But, and I'm not saying like anything about like, I honestly don't know the experiences with the drinking and drugs, but I do know with cutting, and that I actually, one of the reasons I definitely like was aware of the addictive factors, I realized that, oh my goodness, I was almost relying on when I had an overwhelming emotion to do that. So I think the other reason why people cut, I think, is that people don't know or aren't aware of potentially other coping strategies that exist. So, and that's no fault of their own, really. That's society we don't have anything in place in society through schools, or if parents or other people around them don't know other good coping strategies, then they don't necessarily have a great coping strategy to use. So it's hard to fix or replace that coping strategy with a healthier one if they don't know any other healthy coping strategies. So I think that's the other thing, because when you have those overwhelming emotions and intense emotions, if you don't have something else coping strategy, well, you need something.
Right. Yeah. And I think also when you're dealing with those intense emotions, your ability to think clearly is also hindered a bit, because I know for me, I knew I probably shouldn't be cutting, and there were probably better ways, better might not be the word, but healthier ways, or ways that wouldn't harm my body to cope with it. But in the moment, that was what was accessible, and I knew that it would give me a quick relief. And I'd say in the short term, it did give me that, but in the medium to long term, it was not helping me at all. Something I want to unpack with you is, what about people, they have someone in their life who is self-harming. What should they say to their loved ones? Like they've discovered, or maybe they've told them they're self-harming. How should they approach that conversation?
Honestly, from my perspective, I think if the person that self-harmed is willing to talk about it, listen. But if they honestly a lot of times probably won't want to talk about it or aren't willing to talk about it. So what I would say is just to make them feel that they are accepted and still validated. So I personally, if I noticed a friend cutting, it might surprise me, just like anybody else, but I wouldn't necessarily ask, why did you cut? But I may ask, potentially, was there a reason? But do that carefully and realize, obviously, try to notice what state they're in. Because if they're in a high emotional state, they're not going to take that well. But I honestly would make sure you just tell them that even though, like, they cut, like, they probably are feeling guilt and shame for it, but just reminding them that it's okay. That, you're not a bad person because you did it.
Right.
Because I think, at least in my own experience, just in society, I feel like there's a lot of shame and guilt for doing that. If you come at it an angle where it potentially would provoke more shame and guilt, that's just making it worse. And might make feelings of, I don't know exactly, but the feelings may become worse, or they might actually resent you in some ways because you're making them feel worse. Not necessarily depressed always, but just, you're invalidating them.
Right. Right, exactly. And I think asking those why questions can feel quite confrontational, and there's an underlying judgment whether or not the person is meaning to do that. So I'd agree. I'd avoid asking those why questions.
I would definitely talk to them in their own time about it.
Yes.
Is how I would approach it. And if you notice it and you want to say something, I wouldn't necessarily go at it from asking a bunch of questions or accusing. You might say this from a noticing perspective of saying, hey, maybe later, like maybe you noticed it, but don't say it right then because you're still in that surprise state. Say it maybe a little bit later when they're they're in a relaxed state and stuff, and just say, and it might still trigger people a little bit, but if you say it, they'll get what you're saying. Of like, if you were to say to someone, hey, like, especially if you say it in a very empathetic voice, if you like, hey, I noticed that you had some cuts on your arm, and I just wanted to say it's okay, and that I love you and care about you. And leave it at that. Don't say anything else. If they want to say something about it, of like, yeah, it was a really bad day, and it was really overwhelming and all this type of stuff. If they want to explain why they did it or didn't do it, let them and listen to them. But if they, don't pester into it. Don't just say that. Like, just say that you remind them that they're loved and cared about, and that it's okay that they did. And leave it at that. Especially like if you're coming at this perspective from like a parent. Or this is your, this is your friend that you really care about, or any of those lines. Your kid, you saw your parent potentially, or a friend. Coming at it from that angle, I think, is good. Obviously, it at the first of saying, "Hey, I noticed," could potentially be a little bit triggering, but once I think you finish your thought and finish what you're saying
Yeah.
and you leave, make sure you leave, I would say. So don't just like keep talking to them like nothing happened. I would actually like leave and let them process
Right.
what you just said.
Mm.
And honestly, that could probably make a person feel that would make, at least for me, I can't say for everybody, but if it's a close relationship, I feel that it would make a person feel validated.
Definitely. Like hearing you say those words, I almost got teary. Like I wish someone had said that to me at that time because
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
exactly.
didn't feel worthy. I think hearing someone say that I love you and it's okay without judgment, that's such a soothing feeling, right? And, these conversations aren't going to be easy, but I will say, don't ignore, if you notice someone is self-harming, don't ignore it.
That's the other thing too, is there's two sides of the coin. There's the
Yeah.
Noticing it, and there's three sides of the coin really. There's the
Mm-hmm.
noticing it and like asking a bunch of why, kind of judging, pestering,
Right.
all those types of things. You don't want to do that. You
Mm-hmm.
should come at it from my side. You should come at it from empathy and
Mm-hmm.
understanding if you can, or try to.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the other side where you know it's happening, but you just, put a blind eye to that. And I think that's almost, if not as bad as doing the
Agreed.
invalidating, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not the same as invalidating with words. But at least with words, they know that you're coming from a place of love. While if
Mm-hmm.
you just ignore it and you do notice it, and especially if they know that you've noticed,
Exactly.
then that's actually worse invalidation, in my opinion.
I agree. And it adds to the shame, and it makes it this, dirty little secret.
Oh yeah, and it also could make potentially, I don't know about another person, but for me, if I know my parent noticed and they're not saying anything and they're just avoiding it, and it's been happening for a while and they just don't say anything, but I know that, especially if I know that they've seen it, um then it makes me feel like they, one, don't care, and two,
Mm-hmm.
also just are like, um yeah, like I don't care, essentially. It's just kind of like throwing you to the wind, so to speak.
Yeah, it does feel like that. And they might, I mean, there's a multitude of reasons why someone might not say anything, but
They might not
I'm
know how
sure
to
they
say
wouldn't.
anything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And I'm sure they wouldn't want to make it worse, but they're just stuck in this, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to ignore it. But I definitely would advise against that.
for sure.
It's,
If there are any
it's not
parents
easy.
listening, I
Yeah.
advise to take the empathy approach.
Yeah, for sure. And I, I started self harming at, I think I was 13,
Right.
and I didn't share that with my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And they were fairly superficial cuts right at the time. And
Right.
they were on my hands and they were noticed. And it was noticed in a public sort of forum. We had friends over
Mm.
and someone said, "Oh, what have you been doing? Cutting yourself?" Like making a
Oh.
joke. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, I did actually. And I just didn't know how to respond.
Yeah.
And that, I will never forget that. I'm 31 now and I was 13 then, and I will never forget it. The feeling of shame. And I don't even remember where the conversation went after that, but people laughed and moved on.
Wow.
But what I told my parents at the time is that I was just mucking around at school with some scissors,
Mm-hmm.
and scratching my hand and didn't realize it had cut my hand. That was the feeble story I came up with.
Mm. Okay.
And my parents, they'd never been through the self-harm personally, and they just kind of took that at face value and didn't realize, or maybe they didn't want to realize, that I was cutting myself because I wasn't coping. And I wasn't honest with my parents until I was think it was about 22. So, almost 10 years later, I told
Mm-hmm.
them what was actually going on. And I was surprised because I kind of always thought, deep down, they must have known what was happening. But
Right.
my parents were just shocked. And I
Oh,
think
really?
they felt a lot of guilt that they didn't realize what was happening. So,
Yeah.
there's so many different sides to this.
Oh,
but
yeah. There's a lot of different sides. No one's obviously perfect, and especially if like you feel that shame, a person feels that shame and guilt, and they uh, do what you felt you had to do then,
Mhm.
and make up a story. Sometimes like people do 100% believe it. Like I've had actually a lot of circumstances with that where because I wasn't they were, I think the right way to say it, kind of like what you were saying, is kind of superficial cuts. They weren't
Mhm.
as deep as others,
Mhm.
how bad some other people have um cut themselves.
Mhm.
um because I always would like cut myself with like a dull knife usually,
Mhm. Mhm.
and stuff like that. But there was actually times with school when I was going through like high school and stuff, and just in general, and they said, or actually even my family, I think one of my family members said that too, of oh, did you get you, did you, are those like cat scratches, did you just get scratched by a cat? And I mean, you know, especially in a public setting or a social setting, like especially if it's more than one person, or when it's kind of not accused, but it's when it just shows up like that, you don't want to say like, oh, actually, no, I was cutting
Right.
myself. Like, I don't
Right.
think anybody wants to really admit it. At least then, they don't want to admit it to those people.
Mm.
So there was multiple times where sometimes strangers, sometimes friends, sometimes family members, I think, said, "Oh, did you get scratched by a cat?" Or those, or they, said, "Oh, there's cat scratches." And I'd be like, "Yep, those are cat
You know what?
scratches."
The same thing happened to me multiple times. Isn't that bizarre? And one
Yeah,
time when it happened, they asked me, and I just sort of went, yeah.
yeah,
I didn't have a
exactly.
cat. I didn't have friends with cats. So I was just like, yep. And they knew me well.
Yeah.
And they just sort of looked at me and they went, no, you weren't. And I'm like, like, it was just so uncomfortable and confrontational. And I was
Hmm.
feeling so much shame. So
I
that's an
think
odd one, this cat
that
scratch
is
thing.
an odd one, and that is an odd one, and I think a lot of people do go at the cat scratch thing. At least friends in high school, I think, did the cat scratch thing as a kind of a thing of like an opener, so to speak, of saying like how I really feel or how it really happened.
Mm,
Uh, cause like I don't know, they didn't actually push it, but
right.
there was definitely some of them when they asked it, and like the body language and
They knew.
stuff. I could feel it. You know how you can like feel that, like when someone probably knows,
Mm-hmm.
matter if they
Mm-hmm.
do or not, they probably did.
Mm-hmm.
A matter if all of them did or not. It's kind of like a situation with your parents. You don't fully know, but you
Yeah.
you have this sense that they probably
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if anyone's thinking of using that line, maybe pause before you do, because you think it might be a light-hearted opener, but for me, it always kind of took me off guard, like, oh shit, and I sort of freeze up. So I would
Hmm.
avoid that. Don't. Yeah, I wouldn't use that
In my
as a tactic.
opinion, I would, if you have a friend and you notice it in school and you're in a social setting with more friends, I would honestly wait to say something.
Yes. Yes.
Now, I know like if you really care about the person, it's sometimes hard to wait.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but if you really, really like need to talk to them or about it or something, like you feel like really like deep about it, like try to wait. Or if you have their phone number, like text them and say, hey, can we like talk somewhere? Or hey, I'll take them out to lunch and talk about it, or whatever, or whatever it is. I mean, don't also. when you take, if you were to do the take out to lunch type of scenario, or you were to get them alone type of scenario, don't just bring that up the first thing.
Yeah.
I haven't had people do that, but like, say at least like, hey, how are you? Like, be like, or like, especially if you're doing like the lunch scenario, be like, hey, what are you gonna order? And like, get a conversation going a little bit, and then you can bring up like, hey, I noticed today that you have some cuts on your arm. Are you doing okay?
Yeah, exactly. There's no judgment in that. But I think the other thing I want to say is,
So, but it's always can be taken lots of different ways.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say is, you can get in your head worrying about what to say. Because I've been on the other side, had people I know self-harming. And even though I've been through it, it's like, what do I say?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's better to say something than to not. Back to what we were saying before. And it's not,
for sure.
It's not going to be perfect, but just try to have that conversation and keep in mind, try to do it when you're with them one-on-one or in a scenario where they feel safer, not with lots of people there in a big social setting. Like, I think that's just too much. But you'll know this person well enough to have an idea of where they feel comfortable and safe.
For sure. If anything, if you really don't get a chance to talk to them and you can't talk to them in person, I do think it's a topic you should probably do more in person. But if you have their number and you're close to them, you can always call.
Yeah.
So, and that's one way to talk to them alone. I also would caution, though, with talking them on the phone that, you kind of try to make a secluded space for them on the phone. So, like, hey, are you alone right now? Am I on speakerphone? Like that type of stuff. And they might be like, why do you care? Why are you wondering? And you'd be like, oh, I just want to have a serious conversation or something.
Yeah. At least it gives them a heads up. Okay, this is not just a light chat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And one more point. I think we should move on to something else, but
For sure.
I think this is an important topic. I just want to say that self-harm isn't always suicidal. I know when I was cutting, I was not trying to kill myself. And I think that's a huge misconception.
That is a
People
huge
think,
misconception.
Right. In fact, I think it's more common that people self-harm. It's non-suicidal. There are, of course, situations where it is, but it's more common for it to be non-suicidal. So bear that in mind.
For sure. I think that a lot of the time, like you said, that's a huge misconception. A lot of people, they see cutting and they instantly go to suicidal ideation, like, oh, they must want to kill themselves, or they're trying to kill themselves. And I think that's why some people get to that accusatory type of thing, because they're up in arms, kind of like, oh, well, I don't want this person to kill themselves, and worry that they're going to kill themselves.
Right.
And that's not always the whole story. Like, they may deal with some suicidal ideation too, but that's not a lot of the time, in my own experience with talking to other individuals and my own self, that a lot of people don't cut for suicidal ideation. I mean, for trying to commit suicide. A lot of people cut, like we were talking earlier, as a way to relieve, or a coping method for those overwhelming, intense emotions, because they're just so overwhelming and intense that they feel like they can't relieve them any other way.
Right.
And maybe some of that has a blend of suicide ideation in there, but I honestly think it's a case-by-case basis. But I honestly would say it's better to honestly assume that it's not first than assume that it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I know it's easy to panic, right? It is easy to panic, but you need to just take a breath and, try to talk about it. And I know for me, I was having suicidal thoughts at the time, but I wasn't cutting in an attempt to kill myself.
Yeah.
So it's complex. But, again, it does need to be Yeah, right, right. It does need to be taken seriously. And I think on one occasion, I actually had someone, like, have you thought about killing yourself? And whilst that seems like a really blunt question, I kind of appreciated the honesty, to be honest.
Right.
But, there's no one way, is there? I think you just got to, like you said, lead with empathy. That's the biggest thing.
Lead with definitely that empathy and understanding. And I think as humans, we really like to talk, especially about ourselves.
Right.
And I think the thing is just be willing to listen.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Feeling hurt. You don't even necessarily have to say anything once they begin talking. Just listen.
Mm-hmm.
You can't solve it. You're just not going to be able to. So just listen. Let them have their voice. Yeah. No, yeah. Thank you. Like, it was really nice to just have this open conversation about self-harm. So thank you for that. And I hope for people listening, whether you are self-harming or whether you suspect that someone you love is, I hope this conversation was useful, because it is very taboo, and we need to talk about it more because it's rife in society. Like, a lot of people self-harm and you wouldn't even know. Holy guacamole, what an episode, hey? I hope you enjoyed that. And please take some time to go just decompress. It was pretty full on. There was a lot of heavy stuff that we spoke about. So take some time to process and just get back in the right headspace. And come back next week for part 2. I'm so excited about this. I know it's not your typical dinner table conversation, but it kind of needs to be. So come back for part 2. We'll be diving even deeper. And yeah, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but tune in next week to hear the rest of it. We're going to be sharing so much more value. Take care of yourself, and see you next week. If this episode resonated with you at all, could I please ask that you share it with a friend who you think could get value from it? And whilst you're doing that, make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss another episode. And whilst you're following or subscribing, please leave us a rating, preferably 5 stars, and also a written review. Doing each of these things is going to help this podcast reach more people and impact more lives, which is, at the end of the day, is what we're here to do. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Remember, you matter, you're worth it, and you are so, so capable. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next week.